Alright, well now that we've got all the UVs done for this character, we're going to do a little bit of material setup, and we're going to start with the head. It's usually the most important part of the character. So first what I did is I made a Brazil Advanced material, and I just switched it over to a Brazil skin. Under here I'm just changing a few things, just some settings that I find to work a little bit better. Cranking up the illum radius. I want a little bit more subsurface scattering. I think later on, once textures are on, we're going to crank it back down. A couple things to keep in mind with this character. First off, you want your UV channel 1 to be UVW to XYZ. Second off, you got to make sure it's two-sided material. If it's not a two-sided material, your subsurface scattering won't work. And what I did there is I measured the ear just a second ago using the measuring tool. And I got the radius for the subsurface scattering for basically the depth of the ear, because nothing else should really scatter too much, but you might want a little bit just to add a little bit of glow to the character. Alright, he's got a weird little divot in his head. I don't know, I'm sure some ZBrush pass we did that happened. Put Turbo Smooth on. Now this tool is called Quick Dirt. I mentioned it in the last chapter quite a bit, and you can see what it does here. It actually just adds a dark area to any concave areas in it, and a light area to the convex areas. So you can use a couple of different settings. There's chaotic, there's precise, there's dense and bumps. There's an invert too, which will actually kind of flip it back and forth between other things. And then there's a soften, a center, and a blur. And if you ever kind of play with these and it gets a little too nutty, just turn the auto range back on. It'll flip it right back to whatever default was. So you really want to make sure that I'm doing a pretty large map here. 2048. I'm going to export this. That's your map. That's your results. It might be a little overall gray in the middle tones, because we're going to use this as a multiply channel, or a multiply layer in Photoshop. Alright, let me just save this somewhere so we can use it. I'm actually going to make a maps folder for this. I'm going to make a high-res folder, and then a work in progress folder. Once the whole character is done, we do all of our work in progress in a raw folder. And then we can make PSD folders to organize stuff, but really just keeping them separated from your work area and then from your final once you're all finished. Same with modeling. Will really save you time, especially if you're in the middle of a pipeline, because then you know exactly what files have been approved. You can see here I'm changing this down to channel 1. And all I did there was under the parameters, I just did a save on channel 2. On channel 1. Sometimes copy and paste will work between the two channels. It didn't work here, so I'm saving them. Gonna open up channel 2, load them, collapse it. It's good. And then I'm just gonna do XYZ to UVW. That'll make sure that when we use the skin shader, it's gonna have some nice little pores, some little finer areas everywhere. So it's a pretty cool little secondary bump map almost. It makes it look a lot like skin. So here we just want to get a nice quick kind of skin feel to this. I'm going to start with kind of a yellowy texture. I want to blur on that, and I also did the levels on there so that it doesn't affect, the midtones don't affect. Got a little bit of a dithered effect going on from the compression on these videos, but it should be quite a soft fall off on there. Then I just saved using Textporter, which is it should ship with Max, I believe. Otherwise, it's a free download. I just saved out the UV maps. Quick Dirt gives you a pretty good guide as well. I'm going to add a little bit of color to Quick Dirt because black doesn't really work for skin. And this is really a base right here. There's Hong's design. Once again, thanks to Hong Lee for designing the character. We took a few liberties with the character just to kind of get some points across, but I really appreciate him coming up with a nice design. I'm going to sample the colors from it because I really like the colors that he picked for this character. And you can see here I'm just kind of painting in some of the highlights and where dark areas are and stuff. Just kind of where tonal changes are going to happen. There we go. Just really quick painting, really. This is not... We're not trying to paint the textures here so much as we're trying to give myself a guide to work with. We're going to use a lot of photo textures. We're going to use a lot of weird stuff. We're going to have concrete on the face. We're going to... all sorts of weird stuff to kind of get the effect that we want. Anything's fair game. I'm going to speed stuff up really quick. Just sampling these colors that he has, and these are areas I'm going to want to work with when I get the textures in place. But already we have a pretty decent feel for how this is going to look. And then the last part I want to do is put in a little bit of a hair guide. So here we go. My amazing painting abilities at play right here. I like to use a lot of photos in my textures, either ones I take myself or ones from sites like 3DSK. Let me just save it. I like to do my naming convention I use, and we don't really have a set one at Blur, but I think everyone kind of follows this method, is where you just title it, whatever the character name is, or even just the part, underscore, the first letter. Next thing I want to do is just make a really simple subsurface scattering map. On a character, you shouldn't have the whole face glowing like a light bulb if light goes through it. And even though we set the depth, it'll still kind of glow in some weird areas. Areas that it might not be supposed to, such as lips, eyelids, areas like that. Up there, I mean, even though these areas really shouldn't scatter too much, for this stage, it might look better before we really have a lot of texture going on. But make sure your character doesn't look like he's Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer or something, or E.T. Alright, so we're going to save that out as a SS map. Then you got two options here. You put it in the SSS intensity, which I find to be a good place for it. And you can also put it in the sub-intensity as well. Both of those control how the scattering happens. You should make separate maps for that if you really want to get some more controlled results. But I can just use these and fade back the amount that it's applying. The numbers next to the maps is how much that map or that material is going to be affecting that channel. Already I can see here there's some areas I don't like. I didn't like that bird-like effect he was getting on his mouth. His lips were getting a little bit big. I'm going to pull some of these areas up. His nose was getting a little bit strange. We're going to do a little bit of work on that nose. Had a little bit of a problem there where the map didn't work quite right, so let's just remake this really quick. You can see what we're doing here is we're just blurring this out. Doing that Gaussian blur again. These maps are really fast to make. And then just a little there, a little on the forehead, eyes, mouth. Fade it back, erase a couple areas. We don't want this to be too strong, especially in those areas. And then we just save it again. And we're going to have to do this again. I'm sorry, the Max crashed, so we're going to just have to watch it again. But I think it's good to see what everything works here. Apply these settings here. Change the specular too, and the highlight color. Now, with the skin shader, you can put on two different settings. You can have your default is just to use the wetness and oiliness, and I think it defaults to 0.3 and 0.4 on those. And the oiliness is kind of the sheen that goes around the skin, and the wetness is the actual kind of specularity, I guess. But you can also, with Brazil, use an additive or just a normal, or even a subtractive, different type of Fong or Blin or even Velvet specular channel. But you can also turn it off if it's getting too wet looking. I'm turning on the skylight, turning it down a little bit. We have no wetness map, and I'm just using the color as a bump map too. And since there's not much texture going on, it's not going to change too much. You can see you're using a little bit of a bluish green color in the specular. Kind of helps to give it a little bit more of that skin feel. Now, because he has some proportional things we need to change, I'm going to take him into ZBrush. It's never too late to do these edits. Well, until it's rigged and sent off to everybody else, but at this stage it's not too late. It's divided it a couple times. And I'm going to bring the texture on it for now. Even though there's not much going on there. Kind of gives me a nice look at how the face really looks with some color. And I changed the material to something with a little bit of shininess to it. So in ZBrush, I like to use it not just for texturing, but for just for kind of reproportioning a character. Some of this stuff is getting a little bit soft, so I'm going to just enhance it a little bit. I'm going to make a normal map at this stage just to have just to start getting all these maps in there. And this stuff's going to be a lot of fun to texture, especially later on when we start using photos and stuff. We can get some pretty realistic and gross looking results. For now, we're just going to paint it in. All I'm using is just the normal brush on standard mode. I'm just enhancing some of these areas that I've already kind of played with. And this little chunk of his head over here where shouldn't be quite so CG and mushy looking. Got a real small draw size here. You might want to, especially if you're doing more proportional type stuff, using a bigger brush with a low intensity is the way to do it. We want to start just kind of sketching in some detail, though. I like to use a small brush. And I believe I mentioned the last chapter too, and I'll say it, or the last disc. If you have a dual core machine or a dual processor machine, make sure that you run the multi-draw tests, because it will enhance ZBrush quite a bit, up to 33% on our machines at work, and that lets us work in real time without having to keep going back and forth in the projection master for this kind of stuff. You can see it in level 4 here. And when I'm working in ZBrush, what I'll do is I'll I'll either use the add or subtract, and then smooth it, and then add or subtract, and then smooth it. This helps you get the result you want to be less lumpy, which a lot of ZBrush stuff gets that really lumpy effect. And on something like this, that might actually not be a bad thing. See, I'm smoothing and drawing, smoothing and drawing. Especially where these scars end, it should get pretty smoothed out. Kind of envision this guy got in some sort of explosion on one of his adventures, so. You got little chunks of skin and flesh that never quite grew back. There's the design. Always got to keep checking your reference while you're working. Even if you're going to go a little freeform, just to have something that you're working for. Can only make your end result better, especially if you have photo reference of real people. Doing something like this, you might find some really gross reference, so you need a strong stomach sometimes. His nose got a little strange, so I want to fix that. Definitely a little thicker nose than I had on him before, too. Alright, here's a deco brush. This is a great brush, especially if you're doing wrinkles in clothing or on a character. You can't really beat it. It's pretty nice. Kind of follows the path of your mouse movement. Kind of has a nice little fall off to it. So just go into Projection Master, turn on Deformation using the deco brush, and make sure your alpha is a nice fall off type. Or could do a little bit of texturing on here already. But in which case, we don't want to use the deco brush. We just want to use the standard brush and set it to drag rect. Keep the make sure the alpha is on the right one. If you keep the intensity fairly low, you don't want RGB right now. It might be a little bit intense for what we want. So turn it down because it kind of adds to the intensity as the brush keeps going. So I know I'm going to do a big chunk right here. So I want to make sure that the brush is fairly intense. Or fairly soft. And then I grabbed some of these from just some photos, and you can use these pieces, like one of the areas we're going to use is the lips. We're going to put those on now, but you could even use them on like that scar area to get some kind of cool results. And you can make these alphas in Photoshop really quick. I'm going to give away a few that I've made on the extras here. Can never have too many alphas. I'm going to make a cavity map and use that kind of as a guide also for drawing in some texture detail later on. So there we go. Then we can use the rotate tools just to kind of get it into place. There's actually a couple ways we could have done this. But for something flat like this works just fine. I want to enhance a few of these wrinkles too. Keep it pretty low for this kind of stuff. We don't want these really too big of gouges. We'll do some smoothing once we pick it back up too. And you could probably use another division. Put them up to 5. Oh heck, why not 6? Now we're just using that little eyebrow texture that I had made, and we're putting it on the scar, and it kind of gives it that chunky look, which is kind of gross. And then we're going to use a deco brush just to paint in a few of this stretched skin that we want. And some wrinkles. Some crow's feet. It's a bit of an older guy, so we should have some. And even though it's really sharp right now, we're going to soften the heck out of it. But first you want to go to a lower res. The smooth in ZBrush works by going from higher to lower reses. So you just jump down to 4 or 5 and soften it out. Go up to the next highest res, smooth it out a little bit more. So we just loaded up the max tangent settings because it's a character who's going to be moving, so we need to be using the tangent normal map. And it made a pretty good, quick normal map here for us to start with. We haven't added much texture detail yet, so this is already a great start for us to take into Photoshop and use as a guideline, and even just for ZBrush to render, or for Max to render it out to look at. Just jump back over to Photoshop and take a look at this. But first, I think I want to make a cavity map too. I'm going to turn up the cavity intensity. Then just click the Create Cavity Map button. What this does is kind of a weird map it makes, but under the different channels, you're going to be able to select all the cavities. So. This kind of gives you a nice high frequency detail cavity map, and Quick Dirt kind of gives you that low frequency, so the kind of more broad updates. It's better in ZBrush to make sure that your maps are square. It's probably better in Max as well, but for this head, I think it works a little better to have a bit of a rectangle shape, at least for now. We can always shrink it later on. So there's the cavity map. I turned the color a little bit fine. It really works fine. So I added the normal map slot to this, and I put the worked overall a little bit better than mine did too. So now the warp tool in Photoshop in the new version is great. Really quick to get your textures in place. I'm just duplicating areas I want, then I'm softening out this area. We don't want any hard edges. Grab the top of my lip here, put it in place. The colors don't look too bad either. They sync up pretty decently, so that's good. I'm gonna brighten that a little bit. It got a little dark in the shadow from just the picture. There's my chin. I'll make sure we put it in the right place. Because of the nature of this mesh, the part where I thought the chin was not where the chin actually was. I don't have a lot of room there to play with, but the map is pretty high res, so I'm not going to reuse. Now I have some shadow in these maps as well, and you really shouldn't have too much shadow in your diffusion map. If you have a little bit, it's one thing, but we're going to go through and fix a lot of that as well. When the lighting conditions change and you start moving around, there's my bloodshot eyes. The mark of a true artist. But I think they're going to work pretty well for him. And using that warp tool again, we can just get this right into place where this should go. And you can do that on selections, or you can just do it on the whole layer. So I got a little bit of a top shot right there. A little bit blurrier than I should be using, but since generally you're not going to be showing him blinking too much, I'm just going to put this in place. And it's a little dark, so I'll probably run some lighting on it. There we go. Hue and saturation is a big part of using textures. Color balance, hue, saturation, levels. Learn to love them. There's Sean's neck. You can see he's got quite a different tone of skin, so we'll have to adjust overall everything to kind of match it out a little bit better. He's got a good neck for this. He's got some nice wrinkles going on. He's got some great stubble going on. Got some much more interesting skin texture than I have, so. Erase areas where the light really is affecting this. I'm going to redo the bottom of my eye too because it got a little lost. Now you see that all these chunks have a huge well for the two different sides of his face, where one side's been scarred, the skin is kind of dead. I'm going to use the sharpen, just kind of brush over some of these areas just to pop some detail. You don't want to go too much though because it'll make some really weird results. Then I'm just going to clone some areas. I need to desaturate some of this stuff too. It's a little too saturated right now. Not the most flattering of foreheads right now. It's been a stressful couple days. So some of these shadows that we're putting in here, you might say it's not good to have those, but what's cool is I'm going to show later on this nice little trick in ZBrush where you can actually generate your mapping based on your texture. And using these little crevices and shadows and stuff, it'll actually push the mesh around. And we'll get my hairline going just based on my stuff. I'm going to close some of these files. My computer's going a little slow and I hate to have it crash. And even though my UV map isn't perfectly symmetrical, I can still flip things pretty easy because I made the map pretty symmetrical as best I could, even though the face is not. Some of these areas got a little messed up. And he won't have blonde hair later on, but since I have blonde hair and it seems to work okay, we're going to use that for now. Close a few more of these. Bit of a side shot of me there. Get the temples placed in. And then erase those edges. See those? And if it doesn't fit too well, you can always adjust the hue and saturation and then set the fading down a little bit. I'm going to merge these layers because it gets too crazy. You could keep your file as layered as you feel comfortable, but after a while I just collapse everything and keep painting. Once again, he's got, I don't know if these pictures just came out a little bit sharper or something, but they seem to work a little bit better. Skin's definitely a bit green right now. I definitely will fix that in a bit. I want this to be slightly stylized, but I don't want it to be too crazy. I'm using the sample brush here, the healing brush they call it. It's great. You can really fix a lot of areas very fast with that. All you do is sample one area, and it'll kind of keep the texture the way you have it, but it'll kind of keep the everything else kind of blends together a little bit nicer. It's been around for a few releases now, and it's really changed the way I work. Once again, we're gonna have a little bit of shadow in here, but as the map grows, it's gonna go away. Okay, we got a lot of, well, it's more detail, especially in this area where it gets really nasty. We want to have some cool wrinkles, and when we run this through the ZBrush filter test, these dark areas are going to come in handy for keeping things to push in. Clone a few areas and save this out. During this time, I'm saving and rendering in Max a bit too. I just skip through that a lot of times because they're pretty easy, ugly tests. So I like to keep an eye on what's working and what's not working. I'm using some of these filters. I used to always shun these filters, but some of them are pretty nice. Inner glow and outer glow are great. You can set it from screen to multiply and pops back out in the middle. We're going to use the NVIDIA map normal map generator as well, which takes this texture map and turns it into a normal map. And that kind of stuff is really great for that, and also for painting bump maps. Now overall I want to change just the hue and saturation pretty soon. But he's getting there. A lot more of him is actually fitting together a little bit nicer. We've blocked in pretty much all the main parts on this body. Excuse me, on his head. Put that cavity map back on. At this point, it's just a matter of tweaking, so pretty much we're ready to move on to the next chapter. Let's put a few more things in place and see, we're just fading some of these back a little bit, getting them right where we want them. Now we're just going to clone these and sample them so they're similar. And yeah, we can do this forever, so we're just going to skip on to the next part of the chapter. Hope you guys learned something on this one.